All right. Well, I had a longer introduction that was going to be absolutely hilarious. We are running behind schedule, so I'll simply note that apart from the boilerplate biography in the program, that Dr. Davies has done and is doing yeoman's work in expanding basic economic reasoning and separating sense from nonsense and myth from reality and fact from fiction outside of the ivory tower in academia, which of course is sort of sorely needed right now. And the program actually undersells slightly his internet impact, because I just checked this morning and his most watched YouTube video on government debt, if you round, has 2.9 million views. So it's right up there with Thanksgiving deep fryer turkey explosion, which is a feat for a video about government debt. So without further delay, because you've come to hear him and not me, I'll present Associate Professor of Economics at Duquesne University, Anthony Davies.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. It's great that I get to talk right after lunch, because if you fall asleep, we can both pretend it's because of the food and not the lecture. I'm going to talk about, well, a tale of two worlds: misconceptions, the media, and socioeconomic well-being. And the story begins with an observation that the media loves viewers. Or I should be more specific, the media loves the fact that viewers bring with them advertising dollars. And so, in an attempt to bring on as much advertising dollars as they can, the media delivers what viewers want. And what do viewers want? They love bad news. They love to see news about wars and murders and salacious business. And if you ask them, do you like to see bad news? They say no. In fact, they'll proactively complain that the only thing I see on major media is bad news, and why can't somebody show us some good news sometimes? And as an economist, I don't care what they claim they want. What I care about is what they actually pursue. And if we look at their behavior, what we find is that major media sites like CNN.com is the 24th most popular site in the US. And of course, what does CNN.com do? It gives us all of the bad, salacious news that people seem to like. Now, there are news sites that will give you good news. One of the major ones is goodnewsnetwork.org. And if you go to goodnewsnetwork.org, you will see actual news articles arranged similarly to how you see CNN arranged here, but they're handpicked to be only good news. Now, goodnewsnetwork.org is a 20,158th most popular website in the US. There's a website, ismycomputeron.com, and if you go to ismycomputeron.com, you will see this. That's the entirety of the website. Ismycomputeron.com is a 58,000th most popular website in the US. So Good News Network is much more like ismycomputeron in terms of internet traffic than it is like CNN. So in terms of their revealed preferences, people are showing us that they actually like the bad news, and major media, being profit-oriented companies, are delivering exactly what people want. And this creates an odd kind of symmetry. That on the one hand, people believe what the media says. And I'm not talking about, I don't want to talk about fake news here. There are some things the media says that are incorrect, but generally speaking, major news sources are telling you things that are true. And so rightly so, people believe what the major media says. But then the symmetric part of this that's strange is that people go one step further and they don't believe what the major media doesn't say. And this creates some odd views of the world in people's minds. We end up in a situation where when people are only hearing the bad news over and over again and not hearing the good news, they come to believe that they live in a world that's rife with death, pollution, inequality, and poverty. When in fact, and I'll show you data on this in a moment, that's antithetical to the world we actually live in. So we've got this weird dichotomy where people believe, the world people believe we live in is markedly different from the world in which we actually live. So let's take some examples. Think about shooting. Of course, this comes around as it has recently, periodically in the national conscience. We become concerned about gun violence, and we want to do something about this. And people say, well, gun violence is getting worse. We have an epidemic of this thing, and so forth. And Pew Research has conducted a survey of Americans over the past 30 years, asking them, do you believe gun violence is worse or better than last year? And over the past 30 years, in every year except 2, Americans have responded, yeah, gun violence is worse today than it was a year ago. Now, if you look at the actual data in terms of, gun violence fatalities, you find that gun violence got worse only in 1/3 of the years over the past 3 decades. And this is a remarkable thing, that we seem to believe that we live in this world in which gun violence is getting worse virtually all the time, when in fact it gets better 2/3 of the time. Now, you might say in response to this, well, yeah, but maybe the bad years are really bad. So we might have more of the good years, but the good years are small improvements in gun violence, and the bad years are tremendous increases in gun violence, so that on net, gun violence is worse. And this is the kind of thing people typically say, and why do they say it? Well, they say it because that's what they hear from the media. The major media, when gun violence gets worse, will tell us gun violence has gotten worse. But when gun violence gets better, they don't tell us it got better. They move on to something else that's bad. So there's an environmental problem here, an inequality problem there, or a poverty problem over there, and they'll talk about those things until gun violence gets worse again, and then they'll come back and say gun violence gets worse. And so all we hear is the bad news. Here's the actual data. This goes back to 1993. And mid-1990s was particularly high for firearm homicides in the U.S. This is per 100,000 people. And you can see ups and downs across, but on average, it's on a per-year basis. On average, it's a 2% decline per year. 2% doesn't sound like much, but compounded over 30 years, that's a gargantuan decline in firearm homicides. Now, the data you're seeing here comes from the FBI crime statistics, Bureau of Justice Statistics. There are other data sets that go back further. I've seen them going back as far as 1964. And if you go back further, you'll find that the 1990s here are a peak era. Gun violence gets a little bit better going back further, it gets a little bit worse, gets a little bit better. But what you do find, if you go back to 1964, is that in the best year, gun violence was not as low as it has been since roughly 2000 to the present. Well, minus the current year. So we're in this era of historically unprecedented decline in gun violence, and yet this is not what we hear. Now, you might say in response to this, okay, yeah, but we're looking at firearm homicides here. By the way, there are all sorts of technical terms running around the background. Firearm refers to any sort of gun, handgun, long gun, shotgun, whatever it is. You might say, okay, but you can commit a crime with a gun even if people don't die. Maybe that's going up. Well, it turns out, not only is that going down, it's going down at twice the rate that the homicide is going down. So across the board, for the past 3 decades, we've been living in a country in which gun violence has been declining dramatically, and yet very few of us believe that. And we don't believe it because the only news we hear are the news in which we got a year in which it went up. We never hear about the years in which it went down. Mass shootings, same sort of thing, and this is what we're dealing with now. If you look at the data from 1995 up to the present, this is the number of homicides in the U.S. due to mass shootings. And this is indeed concerning. You can see these numbers going up and up as time goes by. And this is what people point to, and the media will point to it and say, we have an epidemic of mass shooting homicides. Okay. I don't take away anything from that. I say, absolutely, that is correct, and should you be concerned about it? Yes, you should. But what the media won't tell you is the other side of the story. And the other side of the story is those orange bars. Those are homicides due to knifings. They average about 15 to 20 times the number of homicides in this country due to mass shootings. Now again, I'm not saying we shouldn't be concerned about mass shootings, but I am saying that reasonable public policy would say something like the following: however concerned we are about mass shootings, and rightly, justifiably so, we should be 15 to 20 times as concerned about knifings. And if we aren't, there's some disconnect going on, that we're going to end up applying our public resources in the wrong way to solve a problem that perhaps is not the largest problem that we should be looking at. We got a similar thing with coronavirus. The media had a field day with this until finally, I think they burnt it out. The people had just heard so much about COVID, they just threw up their arms and said, I've had enough. I'm going home. I don't care about it anymore. I went to Portugal recently, and it was the funniest thing. We're in the airport. Apparently the Portuguese have done this. They've just thrown up their hands and said, we're done with it. We don't care. And in the airport, nobody's requiring masks. On the plane, there's all kinds of announcements saying if you're on the plane to France, if you're on the plane to UK, they're requiring masks. You're going to wear it the whole time, all of this. Portugal, they didn't say anything. We asked. They said, oh, we don't do whatever you want. That's fine. You get to Portugal, there's signs saying wear a mask. Nobody wears a mask. You do whatever. I think what's happened is the media has saturated this topic so much that people have become inured to it. So let's look at what happens here. Here's the number of deaths by COVID on an annualized basis, and this was at the height of COVID, so this is not counting 2022 or even the late part of 2021. Annualized basis, deaths from COVID. Absolutely correct. Nothing wrong with that. Should you be concerned about it? Yes, you should be concerned about it. We're talking about over 350,000 people, Americans. But again, the media doesn't put this in perspective because they're focused on telling us only the bad news. Put it in perspective. Here are the 3 largest killers on an annualized basis, actually 5. Heart disease, cancer, third is COVID, stroke, and Alzheimer's. Heart disease and cancer far outweigh, on an annualized basis, the number of deaths that COVID represents. Now, you might say, rightly so, in response, yeah, but you really can't compare COVID to heart disease and cancer because COVID is a communicable disease. Heart disease and cancer aren't. So you get COVID, you could spread it to somebody else and so forth. You can't spread heart disease like that. That's absolutely correct, except that argument cuts both ways. Because COVID is transmittable, we can develop an immunity to it. Now, hopefully we develop it sooner. Hopefully we can develop it better with vaccines as we go along. But even if we did nothing, we develop naturally an immunity to COVID. So eventually, even if we did nothing, COVID deaths would tail out. Not so with heart disease and cancer. Those things continue year after year after year. And so what the media is doing here is telling us the thing that scares us. COVID terrified us, and that's what we heard about. Heart disease and cancer, I mean, yeah, these are scary things, but they didn't terrify us to the extent that COVID did, and so we don't hear about those. And in not hearing about them, we get this imbalanced view of the world, that so many Americans are dying of this thing, we've got to do something about it. Again, not to say we shouldn't do something about it, but if 5 times the number of people are dying of heart disease and cancer than are dying of COVID, then however many dollars we're spending on COVID, we should be spending 5 times that on heart disease and cancer. In fact, the amount we spend on heart disease and cancer end up being something like 1/100th of what we spent on COVID. And this becomes very interesting if you go to Google and look up news articles over the past couple of years and involving COVID. And if you look at March to May of 2020, The topics you'll see are about COVID deaths, and this is what the media was reporting, COVID deaths, and you know the story in the evening news. The headline was, how many people died today of COVID? And what happened is, after May of 2020, COVID deaths started to turn around. They started to come down. And in coming down, they're no longer as scary as they were before. And if they're not as scary as they were before, your attention goes somewhere else. When I lose your attention, I lose advertising dollars. I need to get your attention back. And how did I, the media, get your attention back post-May 2020? I shifted. I started talking about COVID infections. And again, if you look at the headlines, you'll see this subtle change. That they stopped talking about, they still talk about COVID deaths, but it's not the leading headline. The leading headline is COVID infections. Because while the deaths were going down, the infections were going up. And then we got to a point where the infections turn around. They start going down, and the media shifts again. And they start talking about COVID cases. A COVID case is the number of people who have ever had COVID. Whether you have it now, whether you recovered from it, whether you died from it, all of that's together. And that's a great number because it can only go up. And so the media starts talking about that. And then that's kind of less interesting because COVID, the word case, is less interesting than death. And what happens is post-March 2021, the media gets hold of a new measure that CDC was publishing that's deaths with COVID. And you hear that, deaths with COVID, you think, oh my God, number of people have died of COVID. Deaths with COVID are different than deaths from COVID. And CDC makes this distinction. Deaths from COVID is you died because of COVID. Deaths with COVID is you died and you happen to have COVID. So if you're in an automobile accident and you die and you test positive for COVID, you're a death with COVID. And so the media starts showing this. So what's happening is the media is shifting its focus in an attempt to keep you as scared as possible. Because the more scared you are, the more likely you are to come back and watch what I have to say tomorrow. The more likely you are to come back and watch what I have to say tomorrow, the more advertising dollars I get. And if all of that story isn't perverse enough, throw politicians into the mix, and now you've got kind of this perfect storm of the viewers want to see bad news, whether they'll admit it or not. The media will deliver bad news because it's profitable to do so. It's what the people want. The politicians can garner campaign contributions and your votes by saying, elect me and I'll solve that problem. So to the extent that the politician can help to make the problem look like a big problem, the more likely you are to get out and vote for the guy who says, yeah, I've got a solution to this thing. And so we can talk about wage stagnation, which we hear repeatedly, more often than not close to an election cycle. And people say, that wages have stagnated. In fact, people say this so much that everyone just accepts this. Someone will say to me something about, well, yeah, but what about wage stagnation? I said, what do you mean about wage stagnation? They say, well, wages haven't changed since the 1950s. I say, how do you know this? And they say, well, everybody knows it. It's been repeated so much that people just assume that this is true. It's like, saying the sun will rise in the east. Well, of course it will. Everybody knows that. Yeah, but look at the data. Here's real median annual wages going back to 1979. 1979 is where, by the way, when people talk about wage stagnation, people who are beating the drum about wages have stagnated, they'll always refer back to 1979. It happened to be a peak year. But from 1979 up to the present, these are real wages, so it's wages adjusted for inflation, are actually up 8%. And if you don't take the peak year of 1979, but you take the 1980s, you see that wages are up 18%. That's 18% more than inflation, and that's the median wage. And it's not the average with Bill Gates pulling them up, right? That's the median wage. Now, someone might look at that and say, okay, I'll accept your data, but nonetheless, come on, 18% increase since 1980, that's what, 40, is that 40 years now? 40 years? That's not much. Okay, that's fair, except that the politicians in the media who will refer to this, and when I say politicians, don't get me wrong, I'm not beating on either side here. I'll beat on both sides equally. Republicans and Democrats do this, right? So it's the political animal. It's not a particular flavor of the political animal. When they'll talk about this, they'll talk about wages, except that people aren't paid wages, they're paid compensation. The combination of your wages and your employer-paid benefits. And if you look at that, that's up 57% more than inflation. In real purchasing power terms, today's middle-class worker takes home almost 60% more than he did in 1979. Now, it raises an interesting question. How come compensation is up tremendously, but wages not so much? I mean, they're up, but they're not that much. And the answer has to do with how we treat these things. Congress makes employer-paid benefits largely tax-free. Wages are not. So if I'm your employer and I come to you and say, look, I'm going to give you $1,000 wage, $1,000 raise, do you want it in form of cash in your paycheck, or do you want it in the form of a contribution to your health insurance? If you take the cash in the paycheck, you walk home with $750. If you take the contribution to your health insurance, you walk home with the full $1,000. So you have an incentive, say, yeah, give me the employer-paid benefits rather than the increase in the wage. And I think that's what drives a lot of what you're seeing here. The difference in the two graphs is actually a rational response to the tax code that we've implemented. And along with this, you hear the story about the disappearing middle class. I'm going to show you an interesting thing here. This is I'm going to show you income brackets for the United States, and everything you see here is adjusted for inflation. And I'm going to divide this into the poor, the middle class, and the rich, and these are the classifications that the Census Bureau uses, and Pew has done a number of studies asking people, what do you consider poor? What do you consider middle class? What do you consider rich? And looking at their responses don't match exactly, but ballpark, they're what you see here. So poor, middle class, and rich, and all the numbers you're seeing are in today's purchasing power terms. I'm going to show you a bunch of bars. The height of the bar is the fraction of U.S. households in that income category. So for example, here's 1970. In 1970, 16% of U.S. households earned what today we'd call $35,000 to $50,000. In 1970, 24% of U.S. households earned what today we'd call $50,000 to $75,000. And 14% earned what today we call $75,000 to $100,000. That's, in 1970, the middle class. 53% of us were in the middle class in 1970. And 33% of us were in the poor classes, and 14% of us were in the rich classes. That's 1970. Now, what I'm going to do here is roll time forward. And as I roll time forward, watch what happens to these bars. Here's 2020, the last year for which we have the full data set. What's happened to the middle class? In 1970, 53% of us were in the middle class. Today, 40% of us are in the middle class. And this is the thing I'm telling you. The media is not going to lie to you, generally speaking. They're absolutely correct. The middle class is disappearing. You're seeing it right here. Dramatic decline in the number of households in the middle class. But what the media won't tell you, but will be happy for you to believe, is that the middle class is shrinking because we're all falling into poverty. But look at the fraction of poor households. That fell from 1/3 of us to almost 1/4 of us in the poor households. And where did all these households go? They went to the rich classes. The fraction of U.S. households in the rich classes rose from 14% of us in 1970 to almost 35% of us today. The middle class is disappearing, and so is the poor class. We're becoming progressively richer. Now, I'll pause here for a minute because when I tell people stuff like this, invariably someone comes back with, that can't be right. My Uncle Ralph hasn't earned any more than he did when he started working as a teenager. Maybe so, and I feel for your Uncle Ralph. But what we're talking about here are not specific cases, but the aggregate of cases. And the aggregate of cases is what's important because when we talk about things like public policy, what should we do about the shrinking middle class? What should we do about the poor? We're not writing public policy for your Uncle Ralph. We're writing public policy for the aggregate, for all of us. So what matters is what's going on in the aggregate. And what you find is there will be exceptions. Some of us have stagnated, some of us have gotten worse, some of us have gotten much better. But on average, the fraction of households in the poor classes and the middle classes are declining, and they're becoming rich. And again, what you're seeing is all adjusted for inflation. This is real purchasing power you're looking at. Along with this, you'll hear the repeated story that the rich aren't paying their fair share. This is political gold for politicians on both sides of the aisle. Because if I can convince you that the rich aren't paying their fair share, and my promise is you elect me and I'll see to it they pay their fair share, what happens? All of a sudden, we've got a majority of people, because the majority of us are not the rich that we're talking about here. We've got a majority of people who will vote for me. Now, the rich aren't happy with this. They won't vote for me, but who cares? They're a minority. So you vote for me, and what am I going to do? I'm going to raise taxes on them and give you lots of stuff. What am I actually going to do when I get elected? What I'm actually going to do is him and haw and make it look like I did something when in fact I did nothing. Why? Because I depend on the rich to give me campaign donations so I can tell you that if you elect me, I will tax them more. I ask my students every year, in fact, more than just my students, I've done this for the past decade, and I have asked high school students, I've asked college students, and I've asked graduate students this question. I show them the numbers you see here. I say, look, here's the average household income for someone in the poorest 20%. This is market income, by the way, which means income earned from market activities. So there's no government handouts included here. Strictly income earned from market activities. The poorest 20% household in the U.S. today earns about $16,000. The middle income household earns almost $62,000. The top 1%, the average top 1% household earns $2 million. And I ask people, what's a fair share for these people to pay? And let's make it as simple as possible. Forget about all the deductions and exemptions and write-offs and accounting gymnastics you might do. Let's ask a very bare bones question. Take every single dollar you earn from whatever source, I don't care whether it's wages or capital gains or rental income or interest or whatever, every dollar you earn, put it on the table. And do whatever you do with your lawyers and accountants to reduce your tax burden. And when you've done all of that, how much do you actually pay to the IRS? What fraction of the money on the table should you actually pay to the IRS? We'll call that your effective tax rate. It's what you're actually paying. And we'll talk about federal only because state and local are other issues. But I ask students, what is, in your opinion, fair? And there's no right or wrong answer. And you can think about this as I'm talking about it. There's no right or wrong answer here. It's just your gut level. What do you think is fair? Now, when I ask students this, I get a variety, as you might imagine, a variety of responses. But when I ask about the poorest 20%, I'll get answers that range from 0 to about 10%, with most of them coming in around 5. It's remarkably consistent. Again, high school students, undergraduates, and graduate students. They come in basically around 5%. When I ask about the middle class, I'll get some people who say, 10%, some people who say 30%, but the majority come in around 15%. And then when I ask about the rich, the top 1%, I'll get some crazy people who say 0, and I'll get some other crazy people who say 100%. But I get, of the three categories, I get the most agreement on this one, oddly. And the numbers come in at about 30%. Some will say, 28 to 32, somewhere in there. But the most agreement comes with this 1%, which I find interesting. So this is what people, when I say, all right, tell me what's fair. This is what they say. So I ask this, and then I say, okay, now let's look at what these groups actually pay. The average household in the poorest 20% actually paid $300. The middle income household actually paid almost $11,000 and over $600,000 for the top 1%. And if you do the math, and you say, okay, of what you actually paid to the IRS, what's that as a fraction of your income? you come up with numbers that are astoundingly close to what the people have already said is fair. And I say, all right, but we're not done yet because we've left something very important off the table. What we've left off the table are federal transfers. That is, the federal government will actually hand money to people. I don't mean tax rebate. A tax rebate is you accidentally paid too much and now we're going to square it with the IRS. I mean just a check, here, have some money. Right? Some of this comes in the form of, you can see the list down there, low-income housing, low-income housing subsidies, income assistance, food stamps, these sorts of things. So it's an actual check that the government will pay to you, or it's what we call near money. That is, the government isn't cutting you a check, but it's giving you like food stamps. They're as good as money, but you can only use them in a grocery store. There's the federal transfers. Now, of course, there are some cases more, some cases less, but these are the averages. The average household amongst the poorest 20% receives $20,000 in transfers. The middle class household receives $16,000, and the top 1% receives some as well. You might ask, why is the top 1% receiving anything? Social Security is included here. That's a government cutting you a check, and it's correct that it be included here because it's also included in the tax rate. So when I say how much taxes did you pay, your Social Security taxes is part of what you pay, and the benefits you get back, this is a check from the government. So if you do the math and you say, okay, now tell me, what's the net amount that you paid to the federal government as a fraction of what you earned in the marketplace? You get numbers like this. The average household in the poorest 20% is being taxed at negative 126%. That is, after taxes and transfers, they end up with more money than they started with. So too middle class. Middle class almost breaks even. If you break this out into smaller groups, you'll find that on average, again, this is on average, only the top 40% are net payers into the federal system. The bottom 60% are net recipients. They receive back more than they paid in. Now, I'm making no moral judgment on this, right? Look, we want to do something to help the poor, and this is what we do to help the poor, and that's fine. What I am saying is, be careful when you hear statements like the rich aren't paying their fair share. Because if you look at the numbers, it's pretty much only the rich who are paying. Now, we could argue that they should pay more. I've got no problem with that argument. Let's make it. But it's weird to say that they aren't paying their fair share when they're the only ones who are paying. Again, this is at the federal level. You might even be tempted to go back and revise your answer as to what's fair in light of the numbers I'm showing you. And that's perfectly fine too. Go back and revise what you think is fair. But here's something important that we don't do. And neither the media nor the politicians want us to do it because it would short circuit our ability to scare you. What we don't do is ask the question up front, okay, what's fair? Let's start there. You tell me what's fair, and then I'll know when we reach it. We never do that. We just say it's not fair, whatever it is that's going on. You also end up in a weird space here where we talk about tax cuts being tax cuts for the rich. When you have a tax system that's that progressive, virtually every tax cut's a tax cut for the rich. Because on net, not in every case, but on net, those are the people who are paying. And then finally, what I think is the most perverse outcome here with regard to the misrepresentation of the world is the misrepresentation of capitalism. And I'm going to use the word capitalism like an economist would use it. Unfortunately, in modern lingo, capitalism has become almost synonymous with cronyism. That's not what an economist means when he talks about capitalism. Capitalism is what other people might call free markets. That is, you're free to engage in whatever transactions you want, provided you are not imposing harm on anybody else. And by imposing harm on anybody else, I mean things like, Garrett's not allowed to beat on me, I'm not allowed to defraud my customer's not allowed to pollute the environment, all of those things are harming other people. Provided none of that's going on, you can go ahead and do what you want. That's what economists mean when they talk about capitalism. or free market if you prefer that term. But this gets a bad rap in the media. Now, what I want to do here is look at some actual data that compares economic freedom, that is the extent to which your markets are free, to socioeconomic outcomes. So what I'm going to do is look at some measures of economic freedom. There are two major groups that measure these things, the Heritage Foundation, the Fraser Institute. The two data sets are directionally agree, the numbers will vary. I tend to prefer the Fraser Institute because their data set is much larger. They look at countries, they look at states, they look at cities. It goes back 40 years. Heritage's is not as nice as that, I don't think. But everything I'm going to show you is based on Fraser's data set. If you were to go back and look at Heritage's data set, you'd find directionally the same things there that I'm about to show you here. So what I want to do is take Fraser's measure of economic freedom, and which includes these things that you see here. And I've listed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 items. Fraser doesn't look at just 5 items. Each of those items has like 10 subcategories. So Fraser's going to look at a society and ask all sorts of questions about the size of government, all sorts of questions about the legal system, property rights, about sound money, about trade, about regulation, and then put a stamp on the society that represents its measure, Fraser's measure of how much economic freedom there is there. I want to compare these economic freedom measures to socioeconomic outcomes as measured by governmental bodies, census, the United Nations, the World Bank. And let me emphasize here, when I say the words economic freedom, I do not mean less government. Economic freedom is not less government, it's right government. So, for example, a society that is unfree will have a government that, for example, subsidizes favored industries, it sets price controls, it redistributes wealth, it succumbs to corruption. All those kinds of things are hallmarks of a government that is economically unfree, of a society that's economically unfree. In a society that's more free, you have government, absolutely, doing very important things. But what are the things it's doing? Things like preventing pollution, holding people responsible when they do pollute, adjudicating disputes, enforcing contracts, keeping the peace, sorts of things that a reasonable person on either side of the aisle would look at and say, yeah, this is what government should be doing. Most people would disagree with the stuff on the left. Redistributing wealth, we'd have some disagreement on, depending on whether you lean left or lean right. But generally speaking, people on both sides of the political spectrum would tend to agree with the sorts of characterizations I'm making here of a government that exists in a free market environment and a government that exists in an unfree environment. So economic freedom, not less government, but right government. And if you look at the numbers, you'll see over time, this is the median economic freedom over time, and 75% of countries fall within that range, and that's not very interesting to look at, so we'll skip it. Let's talk about economic freedom and income. What I'm going to do here is take all the countries of the world and divide them into two groups. The half that are below the midpoint on economic freedom for that year, and the half that are above the midpoint for economic freedom in that year. So the less economically free, the more economically free. And I'm going to ask the question, how much income is there per capita basis? PPP, that's economics lingo, which means the numbers I'm about to show you are adjusted for differences in costs of living. So yes, it's cheaper to live in Mexico than it is in the US, and that's already reflected in the numbers. Inflation adjusted, and we're looking at this time period, 1990 to 2015. So here's the first story. If you take the half of countries on the planet that are less economically free, the average, of course, some more, some less, but the average per capita income, $4,000 over this period. For the countries that are more economically free, average income, $24,500. Much more income on a per-person basis in the economically free countries. Now, you might state as a counter-argument, look, people in rich countries have a greater ability to be concerned with economic freedom. I mean, look at all of us, right? We're whatever we are here, 30, 40 people in a room. We just had a nice lunch. We're spending our afternoon talking about esoteric things involving economic freedom. None of us is concerned about how we're going to feed our children this evening. None of us are concerned that the roof's going to blow off our house and we're going to come back and there's going to be nothing there, or animals will escape, or whatever it is. We have the leisure to talk about stuff like this, to be concerned about stuff like this. Maybe the causality goes the other direction, that societies that are economically free, the people there have the leisure to think about this stuff and be concerned about it. So maybe it's the case that rich countries are free because they're rich, rather than being rich because they're free. That's a very good counter-argument. One way to address it is to look only at poor countries. So what I'm about to show you is the bottom quintile of countries, so the bottom 20% in terms of income, the poorest of the poor. I'm going to take the poorest of the poor countries, I'm going to divide them into two groups. The group that is less economically free amongst the poorest of the poor, and the group that's more economically free amongst the poorest of the poor. And ask, how do their incomes differ? Here's the less economically free on the left, the more economically free on the right. And what do you see? You see two things. Look at the per capita incomes. And this is adjusted for differences in cost of living. So when you see $660 a year, that's what we call today $660 a year. These are incredibly poor countries, and yet the same phenomenon. The poor countries that are more economically free have higher incomes than the poor countries that are less economically free. All right, you might say, that's fine, but I know what's going on here. What's going on is in these more economically free countries, you've got people like Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and Elon Musk who are pulling your averages up. You might have higher per capita income, but I guarantee you've got much more income inequality with economic freedom. Same thing. All the countries that plant, divide them into two groups. The less economically free, the more economically free. And measure income inequality. Income inequality, for those of you that don't mess with it that much, is measured by what economists call the Gini coefficient. It's just our measure of income inequality. So when you hear people say things like, income inequality has gone up, they're referencing this measure I'm about to show you. Up is bad, down is good. What you find, there are exceptions, but on average, the countries that are more economically free actually exhibit less income inequality than the countries that are less economically free. How about poverty? Now, of course, you would imagine that the more economically free countries have less poverty because I've already shown you they have more income. So what I want to do here, I want to talk about, these are the UN's definitions of poverty and extreme poverty. So poverty is $550 per day per person in US dollar terms. Extreme poverty is $1.90 per day per person. I'm going to look only at the poorest of the poor countries. And again, divide them into two groups, the poor countries that are economically free, the poor countries that are economically unfree. And what do you see? These are the poverty rates in these countries. This is just standard poverty. And again, two things. One, the poverty rates are astronomical, right? We get concerned here when our poverty rate tops 15%. We're talking about stuff above 50% in one case, almost 50% in the other. And yet, the same pattern. The poor countries that are more economically free exhibit lower poverty rates than the poor countries that are less economically free. If you look at extreme poverty, same thing. Still the numbers are high, but they're lower for the more economically free countries. Economic freedom and child labor, same kind of story. Child labor is lower amongst the more economically free countries. And you might say in response, I know exactly what's going on there. You rich countries that are quote-unquote economically free, you have child labor laws that protect your children. And what do you heartless capitalists do? You go and open factories in countries that don't have child labor laws, and you exploit their children. That's a reasonable counterargument. But if that's the case, then what we should see is that when I look at the poor countries, I should see higher child labor rates amongst the economically free countries, that is, the countries that would tend to have less in the way of child labor laws. If indeed it's the rich countries exporting child labor to poor countries, I should see more child labor among the poor economically free countries. And in fact, I don't. I see the same pattern I see with the rich countries. Countries that are more economically free have lower child labor rates. And I'll tell you an interesting story here. There are, in the South Pacific, there's a tribe in which the women wear gold rings on the neck. I know you've seen pictures of this. And it's a sign of wealth, and over their lives, they add more and more gold rings, so their necks become, it looks like their necks are elongated. Actually, what's happening is their shoulders bones are being pushed down. And a reporter this would have been about a decade ago now, a reporter went and did a story on these women. Because at this point in time, these islands were becoming a tourist destination. So Westerners, you can picture the guy fat on a Big Mac with this Panama hat and this speckled shirt. He goes and has a picture taken with this woman. Hands her $5. This was going on. And so the reporter comes to do a story. And the reporter, to the reporter's credit, says, look, I came here to do this story to expose this exploitation of these women. And so he sits down at one point and he's conducting an interview with one of these women, of course through a translator, and he says, okay, so tell me about this. How does this exploitation make you feel? And she says, what? He says, the exploitation, the fact these people are, clearly this is a hard way that you're living here, this is bad for you, all of this stuff, and the Westerners are coming here and they're paying you $5 to take a picture with you. This is exploiting your condition. And when the translator finally gets the meaning through, the woman says to the reporter, for generations, this is the way life has been. I live this way. My mother lived this way. Her mother lived this way. But for the first time, the women in our village are earning good money. And because of this, my daughter will not live this way. And there you see what's driving these numbers. Economic freedom is about allowing you to do whatever it is that you think is in your best interest, provided you aren't imposing harm on somebody else. When you do that, what naturally happens is parents look for ways to make their children's lives better. Now, does that mean the children won't work? No, it doesn't. In some cases, children working in the factory is the best of the alternatives. Now, that's a sucky world to live in, don't get me wrong. But if that is truly the best of the alternatives, and you step in and you take it away, by definition, you just made those children's lives worse off. 5 minutes, I thought I had an hour. Okay. Garrett's falling asleep, he wants me to stop. Economic freedom and human development. You might ask questions about, what about that life is more than just income? The United Nations maintains measures on human development. Human development includes, yes, it's income, it's standard of living, but it also includes things like education, access to health care. And the UN goes around every couple of years, looks at countries and puts a stamp on the country that represents the amount of human development that's going on there. And if you take the UN's data and you split those countries in half, the low economic freedom, the high economic freedom, you find the same phenomenon again. More economic freedom more human development amongst the countries that are more economically free. Economic freedom and entrepreneurship, same story. More entrepreneurship amongst the more economically free countries. Economic freedom in the environment, and this is where even staunch free marketers will say, look, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Something's got to give here. What's got to give is that all this wonderfulness I'm showing you is coming at the expense of the planet. That's atmospheric pollution. Less economically free, more economically free. Significantly lower in the more economically free countries. This is deforestation. The down bar is deforestation, the up bar is reforestation. The more economically free countries actually are increasing their forests, they're not declining. And you might look at this and say, okay, but really, this is a rich country effect. It's like in the US, we're going to populate our forests because we like the green forest, and the stuff we want to grow to eat, we're going to grow that by proxy in the Amazon, let them cut down their forests. That's a reasonable counterargument. But again, if we look only at the poor countries, you see this. Now, you see deforestation across the board when you look at the poor countries, but you see the same pattern. Less deforestation amongst the more economically free countries. More deforestation amongst the less economically free. So societies with economic freedom, they enjoy higher incomes, less inequality, less poverty, less child labor, less air pollution, less deforestation, better human development, more entrepreneurship, and I haven't shown you data for it, but it's also better gender empowerment, less gender inequality, and they're more peaceful, both domestically toward their own people and foreign, with respect to foreign governments. And you might say, back up, you might say in response to this, okay, but you're comparing countries to each other. And countries are markedly different. Different languages, different cultures, different histories, different circumstances. Maybe what's going on here is driven mostly not by economic freedom, but it's driven by some differences amongst the countries. That's also a reasonable counterargument. One way to at least partially address it is to look at societies that have basically the same history, basically the same culture, basically the same language, basically the same mores, basically the same legal system. That is, we can look at the 50 states of the United States and make the same comparisons there that I just showed you across countries. And if you want to read our paper on it, you can find it here in the Journal of Social Philosophy and Policy. But if you do this, if you perform the same analysis to the 50 states that I just showed you across countries, you find the same thing. U.S. states with greater economic freedom experience higher incomes, lower unemployment, less poverty, less income inequality, fewer uninsured people. Greater population growth, and this last one is fascinating, less state and local government debt. All sorts of ways that people on both the left and the right could agree. This indicates a more healthy society. It's highly correlated with economic freedom. So what you say? Well, we come back to this story of, look, the media loves the eyeballs because the eyeballs bring advertising dollars, and the eyeballs like salacious stuff. We like to hear that we live in a hellscape of death, pollution, inequality, and poverty. And all of that leaves us, well, with a sad case in which we think that we live in this horrible world. And I know people, you probably know people as well, in fact, you might be one, who thinks that the world is just going to hell and things are so horrible. And it's sad because that's not what the data indicate. It's not to say that the world is perfect, of course not. We're at a Catholic school, so I can quote Jesus. The poor you will always have among you. We will always have problems. But the problems are not the hellscape that the media suggests. So this that we're seeing from the media makes our own lives sadder. But more perversely, when you start taking this phenomenon and you combine it with politicians and you apply it to the concept of capitalism, that is free markets, you end up in a space where people honestly come to believe that the way to make society better is to do the exact opposite thing that the evidence clearly says makes society better. And that becomes very dangerous for all of us. If you've enjoyed this, I will make a shameless plug for my book, Cooperation and Coercion, which you can find on Amazon, and there's an audio version on Audible, where we talk about much of the stuff that you, not all the stuff, but some of the stuff you saw here and a bunch of other stuff as well. It's a popular press book, so it's not necessarily aimed at academics, but there's 250 citations in there. So every fact that we show you is sourced, and there's a tremendous amount of data like I've shown you here, but presented in a palatable way. So it's exactly the sort of thing you absolutely want to assign to your students.